Well, everyone, we're going to start the final and surely the best panel. The others were all right. This will be scintillating. Probably a little higher key than Larry Summers was. As you saw, he was subdued today. But we really have a remarkable panel and a remarkable paper. From my left, extending along, Alan Blinder, who is not only one of the most distinguished economics professors in the country at Princeton, but of course held both the vice chairmanship of the Federal Reserve and was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Cecilia Munoz, who is currently the head of the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Mark Morial, head of the National Urban League, and Alice Rivlin, who also, like Alan, held most positions that I'm familiar with in the executive branch of the government and is a dear friend of mine. We're going to begin with Alan presenting a summary of his really quite remarkable paper. I hope you've all had a chance to look at it, and if those of you who haven't, will do so, because this is a really, really important subject. How to think about fiscal policy broadly, and how to think about using it more effectively relative to the next recession. So, Alan?
So let's see here. Okay, that's the title. This is the beginning of the substance, and I'm not going to waste any time on the title. I want to just take a minute or two, since not everybody sitting here does economics, not to mention does macroeconomics for a living. In fact, probably almost nobody here does macroeconomics for a living. To take you back not very long ago to the beginning of the 2000s, and even after that, where there was a quite strong consensus among professional economists, and by the way, not just in the United States, that what we call stabilization policy, and I'm only going to talk about half of the stabilization policy, which is propping up a weak economy, getting it growing faster, was a job for monetary policy, as it says. This was my bad artwork. Those are two pillars. So the case had two pillars. One was that, as it says here, monetary policy could always do the job by itself, and therefore fiscal policy was superfluous anyway. And besides, even if it weren't superfluous, it was hopeless for the reason that you see here. Too slow, too political, and you might say, I guess I feel compelled to say after Congressman McGovern was sitting here before, too silly. That was the consensus. So just forget about fiscal policy, and if we're going to do any stabilization, propping up weak economies, shortening recessions, or even preventing them, in our country, it's the Federal Reserve. So what's wrong with these two propositions now? Well, the first one, I think, is self-evidently wrong. And what we learned in the Great Recession is if you have a real whopper, and especially if it comes fast, monetary policy is not going to be up to the task, even if they do everything right. There's just not enough ammunition in the cannon, and you can't light the cannon fast enough. And we sort of knew that, but didn't really think. We thought that was an intellectual conundrum that we would never actually face in reality. Now we faced it in reality, and much more importantly, as you look forward in time, we're going to be living in a much lower interest rate environment than we've lived in the past. And so these problems with monetary policy hitting what's sometimes called the zero lower bound, that is, you can lower the policy rate to zero, but you can't go lower. That's not quite true, but you can only go a little bit lower, is going to be much more relevant in the future than it's been in the past. The second thing, so that's the bad news. The good news is that despite the political difficulties, and there were extreme political difficulties, fiscal policy has shown itself a couple of times to be capable of actually doing something to improve very negative economic situations. I think it probably has to be very negative to overcome the political barriers, but when they are negative enough, fiscal policy can and indeed has stepped up to the plate, which is not to say it's not very political. I want to come to that shortly. So if you take the attitude that in the future, when we're fighting recessions, we're going to have to use fiscal policy a lot more than in the past, what could we do to make that anti-recessionary weapon more effective? So there's more. This is a very long paper, so there's more than this in the paper. But in the time allotted to me, I just want to hit these 4 points. First, more automaticity. Have more things that move counter-cyclically that don't require acts of Congress. Like economists call these automatic stabilizers. We can create automatic stabilizers. We can make, you heard Sean Donovan in the opening session talk about the administration's proposal to make extended benefits on their unemployment insurance, that's UI, automatic, right into law that they just go up in steps, and we've just been talking about SNAP. FMAP is the Medicare payments to states, and et cetera. There are things that we can do that would make fiscal policy more quicker acting, but maybe more important than that, less political, because they're already in the law and that just happens. Nobody has to pass a bill. Second, especially since many societies, and certainly including ours, seem very, very concerned with budget deficits. I could argue more concerned than we should be, but just leave that aside. We ought to be paying more attention to the so-called bang for the buck. That is, pick things that have high multipliers, as we say in the economic jargon. So again, on these two criteria, SNAP and unemployment insurance score very highly. You give money to a recently unemployed person or someone on food stamps, they spend it, and they spend it fast. On the other hand, business tax cuts, which a party not to be mentioned here sometimes favors, score very poorly on this criterion. And indeed, I suggest in the paper there's a kind of a theorem of political economy which says that business lobbyists go for the lowest bang for the buck, not the highest, because they want the bucks. If you go for something with high bang for the buck, you don't need to put a lot of bucks in the shotgun. If you go for something that's really weak, you need a lot of money. So that's the second point. Third point, which Sean Donovan made when he got up here right at the beginning, is we made a mistake in the United States, and we're not the only country that did this, and this was certainly not the only time that it happened, of pulling the plug on stimulus too soon. By the way, out of fear of the budget deficit. So this is linked to what I was just saying a moment ago. So U.S. fiscal policy was strongly expansionary in 2009, 2010. Then it started moving in a contractionary direction over the next several years, and in fact was a drag on growth in years 2011, 12, and 13, sort of ending in 2014. But you know, we were trying to get the ship of the economic ship moving forward, and there was this anchor holding it to a stone, and that was the fiscal contraction that we were doing. And the final thing is cash for clunkering things where possible. Let me explain. The Cash for Clunkers program, which was not part of the stimulus, but it was actually earlier than the stimulus bill, offered people subsidies to turn in their old clunker, their gas-guzzling car, and earn some money towards the purchase of a new car. There were two very important aspects of that, which I raised the question whether they're replicable beyond automobiles. One is it's something that goes on and it's going to go off in a modestly short period of time, which gives people the incentive to hurry up their purchases. It's sometimes criticized. I've actually heard it criticized for that. But that's actually its intent, get them to hurry up their purposes. Second thing is, if you were around in this country at the time, there was a truly enormous amount of advertising by the automobile companies, giving the government a gigantic helping hand in getting the word out and getting people into automobile showrooms. As I say, that was, I think that is one of the secrets of its success. Whether it's replicable beyond cars is a question worth thinking about. If I can have one more minute. I just want to end by emphasizing something that I thought Larry Summers would emphasize, but he was talking about somebody else.
You mean other than himself, or?
Well, both, but never mind. The question of hysteresis. So hysteresis is a technical term you hear from economists. We get it from physics, actually, which means that contrary to the main prevailing doctrine in economics, which is economies, when they suffer slumps, go back to where they used to be, go back to the previous trend, there's starting to be mounting evidence that that's not so. This is just one observation. This is what happened in the United States in the slump, and then you see what's happened since. It doesn't look to me like we're going back to the pre-recession trend. To the extent that that is true, and this is still controversial among technical economists, it multiplies the importance of shortening recessions by an order of magnitude or more important than we thought before. And I just want to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
I have some instructions here as to which of the panelists I'm supposed to ask questions of in which order. I don't intend to follow those instructions. So I'm actually going to start with you, Alan, and then we'll go further. There was a discussion in the first panel, which I'd like to hear your views on. I think a lot of other people would too, given your very special background in terms of both fiscal and monetary policy. Remember, Alan was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, which is how much ammunition from a monetary policy point of view is actually left, in your view?
There's a lot of ammunition, technically, that is how many missiles you could shoot off, but they don't have a lot of punch. When they land, they don't make a big explosion. So the Fed, if a recession should become imminent within the next year, say, the Fed will have a little bit of interest rate cutting it can do, maybe a very, very little bit. It depends how much it's gone up between now and whenever the date is. I think there is room to go negative on the interest rate that the Federal Reserve pays to banks for the reserve deposits. The Fed for years was trying to convince me that this would be the end of known civilization if they did this. Then it happened in Denmark, Sweden, the EU, Japan, et cetera, and none of those, I think all of those countries are still here, as far as I know, and they even have financial markets, actually. So I think we can go beyond 0, but we can't go to -5 or anything. Larry was making this point. My guess is we can go beyond -75, which is, but that's the
75 basis points.
75 basis points below 0. That's the lowest that we actually see existing right now in the world. So there's not a lot there. What I meant, especially by you could shoot a lot more missiles, is there is no natural limit on QE, quantitative easing, acquiring assets. The Fed can keep doing that. At some point, that would require an act of Congress, and that's when it becomes impossible to broaden the scope of what assets the Fed is allowed to buy. Our central bank is quite restricted compared to most other central banks in the world. But the Fed's not there yet. There are still more things that it could buy. But there's no reason to think that these have a high bang for the buck, to use the same phrase that I was using, which means if you want to have an appreciable effect on the economy, you're keeping count in trillions, not billions. So And the Fed could start running out of things that it needs to buy. And then Larry went over these also. The other thing is talk, Federal Reserve talk, forward guidance, we know, call it. It could do more on that. So it's got these three weapons, so to speak, still there, but there just doesn't look to be a lot of oomph left.
Okay. Cecilia, let me turn to you.
Okay.
And thank you again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Much of Alan's paper, and I must say you had pitifully short time to summarize it because it's really a very long and important one. Much of Alan's paper talks about making fiscal policy more effective and things we could do like greater automaticity that would make it more responsive to the next recession and in some respects just better. As you look back on the Recovery Act and the Great Recession, which gave rise to it, what would you do differently in terms of the Recovery Act than was done? And let me give you a little example of what I mean. The Recovery, but this is an example of one aspect of it. The Recovery Act, for reasons that still mystify me, is viewed quite widely as not having been effective. I personally think is at odds with the facts. I mean, way at odds with the facts.
You're right about that.
But that's a problem in and of itself. So anyway, what would you do differently looking back on it?
So it's an interesting question. I agree with you that the Recovery Act is wildly underestimated with respect to what it accomplished. The Council of Economic Advisors calculated that between the Recovery Act the Recovery Act by itself accounts for about 6 million, what they measure as job years. And when you add the fiscal policies which followed it, is about 9 million up to about 2012, which is some serious impact. I guess what I wish, and this is a variant of your question, what I wish had gone differently was that the conversation, even during the transition leading up, the Recovery Act passed in the first 3 weeks of the administration. And I was working actually with governors and mayors. I was in the intergovernmental affairs job then. Frankly, even among governors who completely got that they needed fiscal stimulus, that they needed as large a Recovery Act as possible, we managed to get 4 Republicans to say it out loud on a letter. And the rest were saying it quietly. They would say it to me, which doesn't do anybody any good at all, but they wouldn't say it out loud because already the orthodoxy was, we're not so sure, we're wild about spending money. And if you recall, it was, I think, 2 Republican votes in the Senate which took the Recovery Act over the finish line. So already 3 weeks in the midst of an epic downturn, this was happening sort of by the skin of our teeth. And I don't know if I'm disagreeing with something Sean said earlier. I missed the presentation, but he's right that we as a nation didn't do as much after the Recovery Act, although there were a few things that happened, the payroll tax cut, for example, and a few other things. We as an administration were trying valiantly to keep the conversation going. The American Jobs Act, for example, which the president did a roadshow around the country trying to get passed. I mean, we felt like we agree with the premise of the paper as an administration and pushed very hard for more, but we had an enormous problem in the Congress. And I think if part of the premise of this conversation is how do we set up a dynamic so that we end up in a different conversation next time we need it, God forbid that it should be soon, we have to have a conversation about being willing to spend money, to make investments. And that stymied us with respect to the size and scale of the Recovery Act. It stymied us with respect to our attempts to keep fiscal stimulus going in the years afterwards. And to use a current example, we're trying to get, this is not economic stimulus, but we're trying to deal with a public health crisis, which is upon us right now with respect to Zika. And we can't get the Congress to have a conversation when we know, there will be children with birth defects if we fail to act. There will be anyway. There will be more if we fail to act. And we haven't gotten there. And we may not get there for months. And those are precious months with respect to this public health crisis. So that speaks to the need for a conversation about the importance of government spending and investment as a way of addressing our various challenges, including our economic challenges.
Alice, let me turn to you. What do you think Alan's paper left out?
Well, first let me say I thought Alan's paper was excellent, and I agree with his description of the evolving consensus among economists over a period of years that we could rely on the Fed and only the Fed, that fiscal policy was too slow and too complicated, and we didn't need that. That was clearly wrong when we got into a deep recession, and we did need fiscal policy, and it did work, and in my opinion, we didn't do enough of it for long enough. But I think Alan's paper leaves out a couple of things that I don't think he'd disagree with. One is that financial stabilization is extremely important. We've talked on these panels as though there's nothing you can do to prevent a recession. Somebody said it's not a question of whether we will have one, it's a question of when. Well, maybe so. We can't repeal the business cycle, but we can prevent a deep, long recession which follows a financial crisis. We need not have had 2008. And if we hadn't had 2008, we would not have had the deep recession that we are still dealing with, and the cost was enormous. So we need to focus on financial stabilization very hard. The other thing is that smoothing out the business cycle is not the only thing, or maybe not even the most important thing that the American economy needs. We need to grow faster and have higher productivity. And I think that could make the recession smoothing easier. And in this sense, if we had a consensus, and I think there is a pretty broad consensus, that we needed to do a massive modernization of our infrastructure, broadly conceived, not just fix the roads and bridges, but this means sewers and airports and a whole lot of other things. And that we needed to have a plan to do that over a period of years. Then it might be more possible to accelerate or decelerate that plan to respond to what was going on in the business cycle. It was true that it's very hard to have shovel-ready jobs when you're thinking of new projects. But suppose you got a long-term plan for modernizing all the infrastructure, then it might be easier to sell the idea of speed it up or slow it down. I mentioned this earlier to Larry Summers, and he agreed, especially with respect to maintenance of infrastructure. But he also had another idea that I thought was interesting. If you have such a long-run plan, you might vary the financing of it. You might take the tax that you created to finance it, which I think ought to be a carbon tax, and say, we'll raise or lower that or speed up the increase when things are going well, and slow it down when they're not.
So, Mark, your turn.
Oh,
again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
One of the interesting juxtapositions between Alan's paper and the panel, Diane, that you just had, is that Alan focuses on liquidity-constrained consumers who, for obvious reasons, have the highest propensity to spend, and toward whom, therefore, anti-recession fiscal policy should be concentrated, among other things. And we just heard about TANF and SNAP and lots of deficiencies in them. Pretty bad deficiencies. So interestingly, the two intersect. And Mark, my question is, As you think about spending going forward, both in the context of recession and in the context of what some of these programs are really supposed to do, how would you get ready for the next recession in terms of what type of spending would you be planning on?
Good. So let me thank the Hamilton Project. Glad to be here. Let me try to kind of construct the response this way, because I think it's important to start with the Recovery Act, right? So, you know, I'm in the camp of having been a strong supporter of the Recovery Act, but also in the camp of having wanted a larger Recovery Act. 4 years, $1 trillion a year. And the reason why is it was clear to me early on that this was not your grandfather's cyclical recession, that it was much deeper, it was structural. The pace at which we were losing jobs was significant. Second, to come forward, we released our report last week. I'd encourage all of you to go look at it at stateofblackamerica.org. We have metropolitan unemployment and income comparisons, white, black, and Latino, for the top 70 cities. The recession is not over in inner city America. Chicago, Illinois, South and West Side, 20% unemployment rates. Cleveland, Milwaukee, Toledo, 23% unemployment rates. The Recovery Act, which was constrained primarily by politics, did not go far enough. And secondly, and this goes to focusing on, quote, liquidity-constrained consumers, it's my point of view, then as it is now, that policies need to be more targeted, more focused on places where the unemployment rates are higher, the poverty rates are higher. It's clear that they are suffering or facing a set of challenges that other parts of a state or other regions in the country don't face, and that the Recovery Act had targeted features in it, but needed more targeted features. And I'll give you one significant item. Too much money was given to the states. More money should have been directed to city governments. I served in state government. States, the definition of state governments is SLOW, slow-moving bureaucracies. And so targeting to the distribution mechanism to cities, to national intermediary organizations, you could use community colleges, universities, and others. So this speaks to what we need to think about going forward. So I think anything we design going forward, if it has, you know, and I love Professor Blinder's, you know, automatic mechanisms and the thought process about that, but it also ought to have features in it that are designed to target the relief or target the investment in places where the problems are greatest. So let's talk about infrastructure, and I really like what Alice said. So there's infrastructure. So if you're going to build or renovate an airport, I've renovated airports, water systems, stadiums. That's a big, slow project. It's got to be designed. You need engineers. There's land use concerns. However, if you also think of smaller grade infrastructure, school repairs, community centers, libraries, the broad range of public facilities. Some of these programs are funded through the CBDG Public Facilities Program. Then an infrastructure program shouldn't just focus on paving highways or interstate infrastructures, but an infrastructure program ought to also have features in it, right, that are designed for smaller projects that can be uploaded 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, 15, 20, and you could do a lot of them. And you could transform a lot of cities. And water and sewer systems, our water and sewer systems are 100 years old. So I think the targeting element, you know, going forward and really thinking about real lessons learned from this recession and how we responded to this recession, how there were excellent features of the Recovery Act, There were features of it were shaped, the size of it was definitively shaped by politics and political constraints. And what do we learn? And so I proposed last week the Main Street Marshall Plan, which is $1 trillion over 5 years. It's a little bit of the American Jobs Act. It goes back and it says, look, we have parts of America that have not yet recovered. And we need to recognize that they've not yet recovered. And we need to understand that raising the growth rate is not going to occur unless these communities can recover. You can get more people working, you can get their earnings up, you can get their spending and therefore their stimulative effect on the economy increase. So there's a tremendous amount I think we need to do, but we need to recognize that the recession is not fully over for many neighborhoods.
Let me pick up on that. I want to thank you for bringing that up because it's like that old thing Lyndon Johnson used to say, I hope you have some questions for my answers. And I had a question that was related to that, and you raised it. And I'm going to ask both Alan and Cecilia to comment on this. 35 years ago, there were programs on the federal books, for example, countercyclical revenue sharing, which were, Alice, you remember that, which contained indices of distress, and where funds were distributed to states and to localities, not just states, based on those indices, the most important of which was the unemployment rate. So my question simply is, do we think efforts like that, and I'm sure we could think of ways to do it better than it used to be, actually are effective? I'll start with you, and I'm going to ask Cecilia the same question.
Well, I think the received wisdom, and it seems like the received wisdom is roughly right to me, is not as effective as we'd like them to be. SLOW. There is this intermediary between the people that you want to receive, whatever you want to receive, and the in the state capitals. This is not just because I live in New Jersey. I think this is true of many, many states. And it's like there's sometimes literally a toll booth sitting there, at minimum slowing it down, but more often actually siphoning it off to something else. And, you know, I remember when I came in the Clinton administration a gazillion years ago, one thing you learn when you come in government, which you don't hardly ever think about except for a very few specialists in academia, is the 50 states matter. We tend to think in academia, we have a country here. To some extent we do, but not that much, actually. We have 50 states. And they have their own ideas. I mean, we've heard in the last panel, you know, the ACA is only the most egregious, but there are many other places where, much as we all love the 10th Amendment, the states are getting in the way. They're stopping progress rather than helping progress. So,
I think that's true. I think one of the frustrations of implementing the Recovery Act is, as you heard Mark say, is that a bulk of the funding streams are state funding streams, and you don't necessarily have much control of that. But so, for example, in this president's budget, we put forward this year's countercyclical proposal around TANF, which I think speaks to your question about whether or not we think such a thing is a good idea, and we've in fact proposed it. And getting to Mark's point, and this is something that I heard, I mean, you're a former mayor, we heard this from mayors as we were preparing the Recovery Act, that they were frequently in cities that were in states that were hostile. And so one of the funding streams, which turned out to be tremendously important, are Tiger grants. So Tiger grants, which fund largely transportation projects, but they are things which are generally ready to happen. It is, in fact, infrastructure resources which get controlled at the local level, not the state level. Not shockingly, tremendously popular among mayors. But actually get money out the door into projects that are ready to go. You could make that, you could tie that to to the unemployment rate, for example, to make it countercyclical. And that would be a mechanism of getting resources out the door in a way that they would be likely to be spent. So there are ways to do it, and I do think it's worth having that on the table. And to be looking at mechanisms, I think Tiger grants are a little bit more directly related to specific projects than CDBG funds.
Yeah, right.
But that is a mechanism that you have to get resources straight out the door, where they'll be spent and where they will do good to a significant chunk of the public.
You know, the countercyclical funds, you know, I have somewhat of a foggy memory, but it's hard to have a conversation about economic policy without a conversation around politics, right? And the pushback to a lot of the late 60s and 70s era initiatives came through a political lens, right? Not through an economic lens. And I think it's in your paper where you mention the absolute absurdity and intellectual hollowness of people suggesting that the Recovery Act didn't produce any jobs. Well, I haven't seen one economic paper on that. I've not seen any credible analysis. What I hear is talking points, political talking points, people making declarative statements with no evidence. And that's one of the challenges with this entire conversation. We're trying to have a serious conversation about economic policy, but politics is interfering. So I'd say to those of you who are economic experts and economists in this office, your voices have to be louder in the public square, right? Because the public and the generation of elected officials almost needs to be re-educated about the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy and what economic history teaches us. What does the recession teach us? What does the 1970s teach us? What does the Great Recession teach us? The Depression, what does it teach us in terms of how we responded and what the effect is today? And that's really a very important, I think, dynamic, right, to really educate people about what this important history and data shows about tools we've tried, what has worked, what really has not worked, so that it's not governed by politics. When we moved in 10 to austerity, it was, it was driven by the results of the 10 election. I mean, it was driven by a political framing, and I was there on the American Jobs Act, and I always felt we needed additional steps, but we moved, and I wonder if we hadn't, if these high unemployment rates I had to report on last week would have been a reality, or whether they'd been a third lower or 70 or 50% lower. I have no idea, but it's important for those of you who are experts, who've looked at this, who review data, to make your voices loud and clear.
Just on that last point, a reasonable ballpark estimate is in the years 2011, 12, 13, the ill-timed fiscal consolidation knocked a point to a point and a half off the growth rate per year. Per year. That's a reasonable.
That's significant.
It's very significant. You're talking about an economy that's growing 2 1/4.
Yeah.
Well, on this point of call it the public dialogue or the public square, you and I was listening when Alan, you just made that point, and that point was also made earlier in the first panel. You all may disagree with me, but trying to recall it, the federal budget deficit just topped out at just around $1 trillion, I think, just a little over, between 900 and $1 trillion. And a lot of Americans, not politicians, but Americans, were horrified by that.
Yeah.
And
it was about 1.4 trillion.
Okay, 1.4 trillion. I can remember, because I travel a lot around the country, running into so many people, and not necessarily business people, who thought that Armageddon was right around the corner because of that. And so, yes, the policy, the fiscal consolidation that took place, which was ill-timed and much too soon, looking back on it, was a mistake. But in many respects, it reflected the public horror over the size of the budget deficit. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if you think really way back on it, and I'll just leave this on the table as a rhetorical question, anyone can address it. you could argue that Washington in that consolidation was reacting to the public reaction, the Main Street reaction to the budget deficit. And so I suppose the question is, what could have been done differently? Because we'll have another recession. God forbid it's not deep and severe, but we'll have another one. And this dynamic between what the public thinks of deficits and what the policy community and the economics community thinks of it will assert itself again. So I don't know how one deals with that. Of course, theoretically, you educate the public to a degree that it better understands and so forth, that these deficits can quickly come down and so forth, and the country has the capacity. But that's one of the things that actually happen. So as I was listening to the conversation this morning and just now, it's natural to say Washington screwed up, you know, Congress never should have imposed that consolidation, except that Congress was largely reflecting the public, you know, whom they serve.
Yeah, I'd say this. So, you know, I studied economics. I studied at the University of Pennsylvania. I have an economics major. I know it reflexively that what I was taught was that the reason that deficits are dangerous is the effect they have on private borrowing, right? And that condition didn't exist. That effect of the recession doesn't exist, or the effect on private borrowing and inflation. So that's an economic theory. The entire time, they were over on Capitol Hill passing unscored supplemental appropriations to fund the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. I didn't hear one person complain about the deficit. When President Obama took office, all of a sudden, the deficit became an issue. What do I mean? It is a powerful political weapon, right? But it's also been used selectively, right? When people do not want a particular type of spending, they'll raise it. All these tax cuts, the 01, the 02 tax cuts, the supplementals around the war in Afghanistan, all of those had an effect on the deficit. So the public has to be educated that the deficit is affected by lower economic growth, less tax receipts. It's affected by tax cuts. But the argument that tax cuts are stimulative, you know, has currency in large parts of the American population. That's actually the truth. So I think it's almost like you need a reset while before a recession, another recession or downturn comes, to really help people understand. And I really think some of this reset has to be targeted at politicians, at the media, at opinion leaders in America, because it's as though on January 1st, 2009, the budget was balanced. And then the president took over and came up with a stimulus, and the budget was out of balance, right? When everyone in this room knows that is absolutely not the case. And so what we have is, we have our understanding of economics, and I think those who understand you don't want to run the effect of deficits, that they are not ipso facto dangerous as a matter of course, and that you've got to be careful about the size of them, have to also make their voices much, much louder to help educate people about these basic economic principles.
Alice?
But I think what we've lost is the ability to have a conversation across party lines and work out some compromises. Our Constitution requires that we talk to each other across the lines of executive, congressional, and party lines. We used to have bipartisan consensus that infrastructure was a good thing.
Yeah, that's true.
And so there was a little pork, but mostly we got what we needed in terms of infrastructure, because both parties thought it was a good thing. We had a potential for a more sensible view of the deficit, namely back in when you and I worked on this in 2010, that we were in a recession. We didn't need to, or we shouldn't reduce the budget deficit immediately, but we did need to work on a bipartisan basis about the long-term future, which would require more revenues and mitigating the effects of the entitlement programs as the baby boom generation aged. There was bipartisan effort on that, but we couldn't get across the line.
I want to turn to a couple of questions, at least a couple from the audience. And let me start with this one, Alan. This is for you. I'm going to paraphrase this question. How, your paper talks a lot about multiplier effects. How do you assess the multiplier effects of infrastructure, given that, by definition, it's a multi-year effort?
So this is mostly terminology. When we speak about multiplier effects, it's on the spending, it's on the demand side, and it's how much spending does a dollar of original spending eventually generate, but eventually means within the next year or two. That's what that term means. If on top of that, which is the case with infrastructure, you get a sort of a long, but though small tail, comes from productivity, it's on the supply side of the economy. So that's the good supply side economics. If you actually put in, and the reason that we economists in talking about that emphasize the demand side multiplier is that it's vastly larger. If you actually do the math, it's quite small. Now it adds up over many years. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing, especially in the needy initial condition that we have. Our infrastructure is disgraceful. But how much, for example, to be concrete, how much would that add if you just added that on to the 1.5 year multiplier? It would be tiny.
Okay. Second question, and Alice, I'll ask you this. It's a good question, which is, are there any aspects of budget scoring which, if reformed, would make anti-recession fiscal policy easier to do?
I think we're on the track to doing that, that the Congressional Budget Office is moving to look as much as possible at the macroeconomic effects of major programs, both on the spending side and on the tax side. And it's happening.
Like a Final Jeopardy question.
Well, this is what's called dynamic scoring, but it's usually not, it's usually pushed for a different reason than the one.
Well, it was originally pushed to get bigger tax cuts, but people pointed out, Democrats mostly, that you have to be consistent. If you're going to consider the macroeconomic effects of tax cuts, you better consider the macroeconomic effects of spending as well. And now, and you can't do this for every little tiny thing. You do it for major bills, and that's what's now happening.
Cecilia, let me ask you this one. Mm-hmm. The question is there any role that an indexed minimum wage can play in stimulus policy?
Oh, that's interesting. I think a minimum wage overall, yes. And it's interesting that I was just on a panel earlier today focusing on worker voice issues with the Secretary of Labor. And it's interesting that among the folks who are advancing minimum wage here in this town, we essentially arrived at a consensus at 10.10 and then 12. And 20% of the country evidently lives, this is according to Tom Perez just today, lives somewhere where the minimum wage is now $15 or is on its way to $15. So we're definitely having a very interesting conversation about it, where what's happening around the country is a little bit different than the orthodoxy, at least in this town. With respect to indexing, I think it's an interesting conversation. I think it's a conversation worth having. I think the the conversation about wages overall is just tremendously important, both because of its fiscal impacts and obviously because of its impacts on the workers that we're talking about. You know, the overtime rule that the Department of Labor just announced last week, you know, raises the level, so we get back to about 35% of the workforce being covered by overtime from in the 70s, 65. But the previous level had been set at such a rate that if you had a family of 4, you were still below the poverty level. So the indexing turns out to be tremendously important with respect to overtime, and the Department of Labor made that judgment with respect to this rule. It's an interesting question with respect to the minimum wage, and we should be having the conversation.
Here's the final question, then we will have to conclude this. I'm going to direct this to Alan. Your paper provides the answer to this question.
Oh, good. I'll stand on my answer.
I know. But the question is, how can we incentivize states to play a more constructive role in fighting recessions as compared to the spending cut and contractionary policies they follow, and to some would argue because of their constitutions and balanced budget requirements are required to follow?
I think it's very hard. You need to incentivize the governors or the state legislatures, whoever is making the decisions in the state, to do what the intent of the federal legislation is, as opposed to stuff it in their rainy day fund and a variety of other things that they could do with it. And you know, you have limited ability to do that, but one thing you can do is much heavier conditionality and matching. That is, if you want to get this money, you got to show us you're spending the money, otherwise you don't get the money. Or make it a match, that we're going to give you a Tiger grant or whatever it is, and we're going to give you 25% of it until you spend it, and then you get the other 75%, or something like that. But I'm not that optimistic on the either on the likelihood that you get something like that through Congress,
or your idea of temporarily financing state sales tax cuts by having the federal government compensate states for the difference.
Yeah, well, no, sorry, I was interpreting on the spending side. Yeah, I mean, I did suggest this in the early days of the big recession, that the federal government offered to make up the revenue loss of any state that would cut its sales tax. That went nowhere, like most things.
Well, let's thank the panelists, please.